Horror stories allow us to confront our deepest fears through the buffer of fiction. Wrestling with the darkest questions of human existence, why is there violence, pain, cruelty, and death, can be emotionally overwhelming. These questions can be too intense to deal with directly. Like an eclipse, the only way to safely view these aspects of life is indirectly. Horror allows us to do this. Horror can serve as a buffer in another way. It can distract us from the horrors of the real world, all of which are far more terrifying than any story about a ghost or vampire. Horror writers are like dark clowns that caper in front of our readers, making grotesque faces in the hope that the audience won't look over our shoulder and see the true darkness of existence behind us. And this excerpt comes from the book I'll be reviewing today, Writing in the Dark by Tim Waggoner. Hello everybody, welcome to DeathGroundReviews. Today I have another book review for you. The book is titled Writing in the Dark, and the author is Tim Waggoner. So Tim, he's well known in the horror genre. The man is an experienced practitioner of horror. He's also an experienced teacher. He has a wealth of knowledge to draw from for the making of this book. The book covers topics such as why horror matters, building viable monsters, generating ideas and plot lines, how to stylize narratives in compelling ways, the physiology of fear, the art of suspense, avoiding cliches, and marketing your horror writing. The book also includes tips and advice from other horror professionals such as Joe Hill and Edward Lee and John Shirley. The book also includes exercises on critical reflections and pointers on the writing process and ideas for characters and story arcs. So a lot of material you can draw from in this book to improve your horror crafting. I first learned about this book on Twitter amongst the horror community. There were a lot of other aspiring writers that were talking about it and mentioning various things they were learning about writing horror. So I definitely picked up the book and read it, and now I'm going to tell you some of the highlights I found in it. One of my favorite chapters in this book was the one that focused on the various subgenres of horror. There are so many different ways you can approach a horror story. And in my own mind, I've always kind of mashed them together into the supernatural horror category, but there are so many other categories. You've got like science fiction horror, you've got erotic horror, you've got extreme horror, you've got quiet horror. Quiet horror, that was a particularly fascinating one. I found it to be a subgenre that would be very challenging to write. And I've realized I've read a lot of stories within that realm of Charles L. Grant and M.R. James and maybe even some of like Edgar Allan Poe. And the idea of it is it's atmospheric, right? It deals with subtle details like the rustling of leaves when there's no breeze, or a scratching at the window, or the strange sound of breathing in a dark cranny of a room, and then all these details kind of gradually build up into a terrifying climax in the end. And it's an interesting subgenre to explore. And then, extreme horror would be the complete opposite of that, right? That's when the monster bashes through the window and rips everyone to gory pieces. The other interesting thing about this chapter is it also suggested ways in which you can use these varying categories to craft and flesh out a story idea. So the example Tim gives in the book is the idea of like a man who goes around and sees faceless people everywhere. And then what he suggests is that you plug that idea into different subgenres. So what if you were to write a supernatural horror story using that idea? What kind of story would you develop? What if you wrote a science fiction horror story using the idea of somebody seeing faceless people everywhere? What kind of story would you come up with? So, you're basically flexing your subgenre muscle and thusly stretching your creative muscles to to build something unique and new to your authorial voice. So that was a great highlight in that book. I really loved that chapter. I loved the variety of exercises he suggests in this book for generating plot ideas. There was one in particular that really stood out to me, and I even used it. So what he suggests in this exercise is, you get a piece of paper and first write out several story elements, the things that exist within the setting of a story, like a broken window, an empty alley, a green lawn, a wristwatch, whatever it may be. Write these story elements out, cut them out, put them in a hat, and then draw from the hat. And then whatever element you pick, that's going to be part of your story. Then you do the same thing with archetypes. So like werewolf, ghost, haunted house, whatever it may be, these archetypes of horror. You write them out, cut them out, draw from a hat. So now you got a story element and an archetype. And then finally you write out various situations, lost or obsessive love, or trying to uncover something from the past, or whatever these story situations may be, you write them out, cut them out, and draw them from a hat. And now you got a story element, an archetype, and a situation. And you use whatever you randomly drew as the foundation for developing a new story. And he suggests it as a great way to, break from your usual routine. Because sometimes as writers, we can get really repetitive. We can get stuck in a rut when it comes to story ideas. And it's just a way to mix things up and to get creative and discover a unique route. Another chapter that really stood out to me focused on the development of characters in horror stories. And there's a quote from the book I want to share. It's, "Horror stories aren't about monsters. They're about how characters react to monsters or to becoming monsters themselves. Imagine a story that only has a monster in it, no people. The monster stands around with nothing to do. Now imagine a story with only a person in it, but this person thinks there's a monster somewhere nearby, that it's coming closer by the minute. And if this person doesn't do something fast, they're dead meat." So in other words, the character is the heartbeat of the story. We, the reader, we become invested in that character. We identify and sympathize with them. And that's what horrifies us so much when that character has to face the monster. There's another section that also emphasizes the psychological makeup of your character. How do they respond to fear? Are they the type of character that's going to fight in a fight or flight response? Are they going to confront the monster and charge against it? Or are they going to go into flight mode instead? Are they going to run away and abandon their friends or freeze in a catatonic state? And these are important things to think about as you craft your character. And the other reason this is an important point is because it would be really boring if your characters all reacted the same way to the monster, right? If each character has their own personality and responds in a different way, then it's a far more interesting and complicated story. Another section that was very useful to me in this book dealt with the subject of constructing a scene. Because Tim, he lists a variety of questions for you to ask yourself before you write a scene. So in the past, whenever I would write a scene, I often would just kind of bumble through it. I would have an image in my mind of a situation. I'd have some flat and unfeatured characters, and I would just start writing. And sometimes it worked out, if it was a simple enough scene, or maybe it had been on my mind for a while. But a lot of the times I'd flail around a lot and get kind of lost and confused. And so I started using these questions he suggests, and it's been working wonders for me. And these are the questions. What's the current action in the scene? What happens? So basically a summary of the events. What's the conflict in this scene? What are the character interactions in this scene? How is the main character developed in this scene? What exposition, background info, does this scene add to the story? How does this scene increase the suspense and deepen the mystery of the larger story? And finally, how do all of these elements work together to move the larger story forward? if the scene starts at point A, where does it end up at? And this really helped me because it developed it got the creative juices going. It did that for sure. It made me think more about my character and what's my character's goal and what are the real obstacles. But it also added a sense of structure to the scene. Every scene now I have an aim that I'm shooting for. So, immensely helpful exercise. So there's not really anything negative I can say about Tim Waggoner's book, Writing in the Dark. There's so many useful exercises. This is a book I'm sure I will reference again and again and again. And I haven't even scratched the surface on all the exercises yet. And he also lists other books on the craft of writing. I'm sure I'll pick those books up too and read them. So, very useful book. There was only one thing that I found in the book to be skimmable, that I found to be redundant and I would skip over. And at the end of each chapter, he includes those tips and advice from other horror professionals. You know, he asks them 2 questions of what makes good fantasy and horror, and then what's some advice you would give to the beginning writer. I think those were the questions. And then he has the author answer them. And the first couple of chapters, it was interesting, but then as I went on and on, I found myself just skimming over them, just completely skipping those parts. So for me, it was kind of a redundant element of the book. But overall, I give this book out of 5 a 4.5. I think it's an excellent book. I highly recommend it. If you're an aspiring writer of horror, this is a must-read for you. There's so much invaluable information. And even if you're not a practitioner of horror, I think a lot of the exercises could still be useful for you too. So that concludes my review of Writing in the Dark by Tim Waggoner. And this is DeathGroundReviews, the monster that devours horror, suspense, and all those things of the fantastic. I'll see you next time.